Yo, what's up guys? Welcome to episode 3 of my 2020 450 shootout breakdown video, where we're talking about the bike that I placed number 4 out of the bunch, and that is the Husqvarna FC450. As many of you know, I've been riding a 2019 Rockstar Edition Husqvarna 450, this whole outdoor series, so pretty familiar with the bike. I thought I kind of knew what to expect when I was getting on this thing, but it's pretty crazy how different the 2020 standard model is from my 2019 Rockstar Edition. The motor and the suspension definitely feel a lot more mellow, a little bit softer. I know there's been talks that the KTM Husky are trying to kind of differentiate the bikes a little bit more and try to make the Husqvarna a little bit more tailored to the vet rider side of things, and then the KTM is supposed to be more of their like race bike, I guess, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit stiffer setup. And I can definitely feel that in the Husqvarna. So kicking things off, just like the other two bikes, we'll go into just like the geometry and overall feel of the bike with the stock components and everything like that. Really like how this bike is set up. The chassis is kind of on the softer side. It has that steel frame you guys obviously know, and it just kind of helps stick to the ground a little bit better in some of those rougher sections. Like I was saying, the Husky kind of has a soft suspension setup, so it really helps on the hard pack tracks that we were riding, just soak up those really gnarly square edge bumps coming out of the corners and stuff. And I think that's kind of where the Austrian bikes excel a little bit more, is on those harder pack tracks where you want some smooth throttle control and a bike that's just gonna soak up that gnarly chop really well. So definitely these bikes were doing pretty well for us out on these Cali tracks. They do put some really ridiculously low bars on this bike, but I think it's kind of a good move for OEMs to start putting lower bars on the bikes instead of taller bars, just because I think a tall guy using lower bars isn't as awkward as a medium-sized guy using really tall bars. It just allows you to get your weight more over the front, and it kind of automatically puts you in a more aggressive feel. And typically the more aggressive you feel, the more comfortable you are, and whether it's perceived speed or actual speed, you do tend to feel a little bit faster and more comfortable on them. So definitely think that the lower bars from the factory is probably a good way to go. Although I think the Husky definitely went a little bit overboard with how low it is. I mean, these things were absolutely cranked down, so not quite a big fan of that, but definitely enjoy the lower bar more than a tall, awkward bar like on the Kawasaki. It also seems like the seat is really tall. It kind of feels like you're sitting on top of this bike more rather than like down in the center of it. That, and then also the foot pegs I feel like are a little bit higher up than some of the other bikes, so it definitely makes you feel like you're riding up on top of this bike, like your center of gravity is a little bit higher, which isn't necessarily a bad feel. It's just very different from all the Japanese bikes. You can definitely tell that you're on the Husqvarna when you sit on it. Just has a different feel, basically. Not bad or good, just some people prefer it that way. Some people prefer the feel of the Jap bikes. But for instance, when I had my Husqvarna, I had to get 5 mil lower and 5 mil back foot pegs, and then I got some taller bars for it, and that really opened up the cockpit for me, made it feel like I was sitting more down in the bike rather than on top of it. Just felt like it lowered my center of gravity, made it a little bit easier to corner, and yeah, I really liked that. So some things to consider there. I know a lot of people have been complaining about how grippy the seat is. They feel like it kind of tears up their rear side a little bit. To put it as PG-13 as possible, I didn't really notice that at all. I actually, in my opinion, the grippier the seat, the better. So I actually really like the stock seat that comes on the Husky, especially compared to some of the other brands that have really slippery seats. It just makes it so much easier to manage that power and stay forward on the bike so that you're not pumping up, just trying to hold on and keep your body forward. So I give that a big thumbs up, like the grippy seat. And then overall, yeah, just the bike feels pretty comfortable to sit on. Maybe it's because I've been riding one all summer, but it didn't take me very long to get comfortable on the thing and just start putting in some good laps. So one of my other small complaints about the cockpit setup is the clutch. Although it is hydraulic and really easy and it just feels nice to pull in, I couldn't quite adjust the lever far out enough to get the right like pull feel that I wanted. I like to have it so that my clutch has almost no play in it, so that I just have to pull it in just a little bit to get it to engage and disengage. With this bike, I had to pull it basically all the way in until it was touching my middle finger, and even then sometimes I would stall it in a corner just because I wasn't used to how it was still grabbing a little bit even with the clutch pulled in that far. I adjusted the lever all the way out, but it was still doing that, and that's something I struggled with a little bit on my Husky that I was riding this year too. So I'm not sure if an aftermarket clutch perch would fix that or not, but definitely would be something that I would want to play around with if I had one of these bikes again, because I was not a big fan of that. One other gripe I have about about the cockpit setup is that it doesn't have those forward mounting holes on the upper triple clamps to move your bars forward. So if you're on the taller side, you don't really have that adjustability, and I like to run my bars in that forward mount, so kind of a bummer there. I definitely noticed it put me a little bit further back on the bike. And if you watch Michael's video about the Husky 450, he mentioned that I was struggling to kind of find some front end grip coming into those corners, and I think it was just because it was putting me that little bit further back on the bike that I wasn't used to. That was leaving the front end unloaded a little bit when I was trying to find some of those ruts. So in my case, some aftermarket triple clamps would probably be a good idea just to get that comfort back in it. Moving on to the suspension, like I said, it's set up a little bit softer for sure. I was bottoming this thing out pretty good. I even had some of the Husky techs come over and help set it up for me, and they were like, yeah, you're probably like on the border of needing a stiffer spring for it. So it's definitely sprung a little bit lighter than like the KTM, for instance, and you can for sure feel it out there. Like I said, I was bottoming it out pretty easily, and I just didn't feel like I could push it as hard into some of those rough corners as I could on some of the other bikes. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, sometimes coming into a corner a little bit slower makes your, you know, mid-corner and exit speed a little bit faster, which is what I definitely felt on this bike. I felt like where it kind of lacked in that snap coming out of the corners, I've made up that speed through the mid and coming out of the corner, just rolling it on earlier, and I was able to carry the same amount of speed without having to slow down so much and then accelerate as hard. So it definitely kind of forces you to change up your style a little bit, but once you get used to it, really nice. You can flow through the corners really well, which is where I think the Husky definitely like checks that mark for me. It's probably one of the best bikes going through ruts. I think the front end just being a little bit softer kind of dives down and gets some good weight over the front end, and then that just makes it track through ruts really nicely. So I said this when I got my Husky 450 earlier this year, it's just I've never gone through long deep ruts as fast on any bike in my life. Normally on a big long deep rut, like maybe 50% of the time I'll like dab my foot and mess it up. On the Husqvarna, it's like 95% of the time I go through it perfectly without dabbing a foot at all. There's just something about the bike that feels really planted going through the corners and just really confident through really deep ruts, so I really like that. Where I think it struggles a little bit is just coming into the corners and trying to find the ruts. Like I was saying, I felt like my front end was just a little bit loose coming into some of those corners, so I kind of had to come into them a little bit slower, but then as soon as I hit that rut, it was like, boom, get on the gas, flow through the rut really good, and come out of it with a lot of speed. Another thing is, I know a lot of people love to hate on the air forks on this bike, but to be perfectly honest, I have no complaints with the air fork really at all. I always loved it on the Honda when the Honda had the air forks, and you know, I don't really have too many bad things to say about this one. It does have kind of a weird spot in the middle where it's soft and then hits a weird like harsh spot. But for the most part, I mean, I love that if I feel like the front end is dipping too far, I can just pump some more air in it and it's good to go. When I rode my Husqvarna at the Colorado Pro National this year, I did notice like towards the end of a moto when the forks would heat up a lot, it did feel like harsher and harsher throughout the moto. Obviously for most consumers, that's not an issue because most people aren't going out and pounding out 35-minute motos on a Pro National track. But for sure, something to consider, especially if you're doing like a GNCC, which can last up to, you know, 2 or 3 hours. Maybe they'll heat up enough to get that harsh feeling, but to be honest, I really like the air forks. It's not bad at all, I think. Honestly, I think the forks are probably one of the best parts about this bike. Like I was saying, somehow it just feels like it has an impossible amount of grip going through ruts, and the word I kind of always use to describe it is like, it feels like a scalpel going through ruts. Like you just put the front end in a rut and it just carves right through it like no other. So I really like the front end on it. A lot of people don't. I'm not really sure why I gel with air forks, but you know, anyways, that's my 2 cents on them. So anyways, moving on to the motor, this is where initially I think that the Husky kind of lacks. I say initially because even though I felt like when I was riding it that it didn't have a lot of power, like I would come back in from a moto and I'd be like, man, this thing just feels really slow. You look at the lap times and you know, I turned out some pretty good lap times on the Husqvarna, and I think it's really mentally weird riding this thing because the power comes on so smooth that you don't even realize that it's going fast, and you can just get on the gas so much earlier because it's not trying to rip out of your hands and everything. It doesn't upset the chassis when you're coming out of corners really hard on the gas. Like I was saying, there was this really tight left-hander at Fox Raceway with this pretty big like step-up double coming out of it, and I remember on some of the other bikes I would have to, you know, make the corner, line it up, and then punch the gas really hard, and it was kind of difficult to make it up over it. And first lap on the Husky, I noticed I got on the gas like 2 bike lengths earlier, and even though it didn't hit as hard, I just carried way more speed and like scrubbed over this little step-up thing. So it's kind of weird how it feels pretty slow when you're riding it, but you know, that translates into some pretty good lap times. So pretty cool how that is, because it definitely doesn't wear you out as much having those really gnarly punches. I think on the hard pack tracks out in Cali, that smooth characteristic is really nice. And I've mentioned on the past couple of videos how I think these bikes would do on the East Coast tracks when it's a little bit loamier. I think that really tame feel might not be as good on some of those loamier tracks over on the East Coast, because you know, you're not having to manage the throttle as much coming out of those deep loamy corners. But for sure on hard pack tracks, you know, Cali tracks, it was really, really nice. And then the smooth power just complemented with that, you know, softer suspension and chassis feel. I mean, you can get on the gas as hard as you want, as early as you want, and it just soaks up the bumps really nicely. Really hard to break traction on this thing. So it's definitely a very, very easy bike to ride. Very user-friendly, I would say. And yeah, no real big complaints. It's just a really, really solid bike overall. And I'd say in the top 4 between the Husky, KTM, Yamaha, and Honda, that it's definitely a really close race between those 4. Like, I think the Kawasaki and the Suzuki were pretty far behind these 4 bikes, but once you get into these 4, it really tightens up, and you have to start nitpicking little things here and there to pick a ranking for these 4 bikes. And in my opinion, the Husky just had a little bit too soft suspension and a little bit of a lackluster motor. And there wasn't one thing that I picked out that like it did incredibly well over any of the other bikes. And when the field is like this close, you gotta search for those little things that make the bike super, super enjoyable to ride. And you know, with the Husky, it doesn't do anything poorly, does everything pretty well, but it just lacks that excitement factor that I enjoy in the bikes. So that's why it placed 4th for me. But for sure, the bike is super awesome. Definitely don't want you guys to think that just because I ranked it 4, it's not a good bike, because seriously, it is a very, very good bike. I think this bike really, really suits vet riders, people who just ride really smoothly, don't like a really gnarly hit. Especially if you live in an area with really hard packed tracks, this bike is super, super good. Really like it. Would not hesitate to ride one again in the future if the opportunity arises. But anyways, guys, that's gonna do it for me. Husky, really awesome bike, really like it. And the bikes only get better from here. So I hope you guys are excited to hear my review on the next bikes. Those should be coming out here really quick. I know I had a little break in videos right now, but I've just really been focusing on getting back into school. And then my brother's wedding was this weekend, and I was the best man in that. So congrats, Tim and Sarah. But yeah, it's just been a crazy week and a half. I'll definitely be churning out some more videos here pretty quick. So keep an eye out for more of the 450 build, more of these 2020 450 review videos. Hope you guys are excited about them. Seems like you guys are really liking them, and I'm enjoying making them and sharing my opinions with you guys. So yeah, definitely keep watching the videos, give them a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you very much for watching, guys. We'll catch you in the next one. Later.